Doug, as always, welcome back to our show.
Yeah, I'm surprised that you showed the Trump Peninsula without putting the name Trump there.
It still says Gulf of Oman and Persian Gulf. I'm surprised it didn't say the Trump Gulf because, I don't know. I guess he's already had the Gulf of America.
Well, if you look at the Trump Peninsula, it does look as though it's directed into some sort of large geographical anal cavity.
Well, there is that. I hadn't looked at it from that direction. Apparently, Gary likes that. Not the way I thought this show was going to start, I have to say.
Well, I think that's about what it amounts to right now for President Trump.
Yeah, and we'll see who's on the receiving end of those kind of things. But it doesn't look like President Trump is really aware of just how much danger I think that we're in right now. Let's see if what you may think of this. This was here just this morning, just less than 2 hours ago. He says that there are no talks or conversations going on or scheduled with the Islamic Republic of Iran. The naval blockade remains in full force and effect. The Hormuz Strait is open and operating. All water mines have been removed or detonated. Thank you for your attention to this matter. I don't know what that ever means. I don't know why he keeps putting it in there, but I mean, let's just look at those in order or in sequence here. Let's start with the end of it, that the Strait of Hormuz is open and operating. Is that your understanding?
As far as I know, the Easter Bunny, the Good Fairy, and Santa Claus have all been resurrected under this administration. So I think that's a perfectly viable statement.
Well, apparently there's some who are more skeptical. And one of it this morning is it turns out that the diesel issue that we've been talking about, that you've been talking about for quite a long time, is now starting to pierce through the Easter Bunny narratives, I guess. This morning from actually this was yesterday afternoon from Zero Hedge. Industrial economy either grinds to a halt or consumers about to be hit with the biggest energy pass-through in history as the diesel crack spreads. And you can see that line in the middle there. When the MOU was signed, all Trump had to do was just let it roll out and let it happen, and the strait would have been open. That line would have continued to decrease. Instead, it started an immediate increase with the 13-day campaign and hasn't come down since. And now it's reached up to near historic precedents. What does that can tell you, and are you concerned about that?
Well, look, we know that right now the diesel shortage has already begun to hit in Europe. And the Europeans, in order to move food and water and fuel and everything of criticality to human life, is much more important to diesel than anything else. In other words, without the diesel in Europe, you're at a virtual standstill. I think we can comfortably say something that, I've talked about in the past, but I think now is becoming very acute. I think we're on the verge of an explosion in Europe, particularly in Germany, to a lesser extent, Austria, Northern Italy, certainly in France and Great Britain. No diesel means serious state of emergency. And, again, what's astonishing to me is that only now people are beginning to finally wake up to the fact that in addition to diesel and jet fuel, and jet fuel, of course, is going through the roof, and we continue to try and suppress that price with whatever we have in stock. The truth is that 40% of your sulfur comes out of the Middle East. And sulfur is critical to a whole range of mining operations, refining, and all of this is going to come down like a ton of rocks on Europe first and on us as well. And I don't know how the Trump administration is going to weather it. I mean, suddenly the stipendiums that are being paid to everybody in the House and in the Senate by the Israeli and their Jewish Zionist agents in the United States may not turn out to be enough to ensure that they do not wake up and suddenly demand change.
And look, I mean, that wake up is going to come here by force, again, piercing through the nonsense and the noise because, and look, I think we have to be honest about acknowledging this in all seriousness. When Trump puts out stuff like this is his true social. This isn't somebody else putting it out. This is him himself putting this out. And when you hear him talk about this, that's where it gets even more concerning, which he did yesterday from the Oval Office.
Well, I just think it's a great idea. Yeah, I mean, we control it. We control it with the blockade. We have a blockade. We control it with the blockade. And I like the idea of declaring it a territory.
Why might you do that?
We have total control over the strait. Now, they can be a nuisance. They can put a mine in the water, and people don't like having mines hit their billion-dollar ships, et cetera. But we're taking out millions of barrels of oil a week. If you look at the kind of numbers that we're doing, the strait is open, and the oil prices are coming down, and they will continue to come down unless we decide to do something far more drastic than we're doing. Iran is in big trouble.
Okay, first of all, the oil price actually is not coming down. And this week, it's actually been going up. And we'll see how far it goes because he's really good at manipulating the paper price of that oil. But as you say, it's starting to actually impinge on economic activity across the range here. But he seems to think, yeah, it's no problem. I think it's a great deal. I'll just take it and declare it. This is our territory. But of course, that means nothing. It literally means nothing here. And the Iranian side, which we're going to get to in a second, has different views on that. But if that's his belief, Doug, what does that tell you about the prospect that this can get resolved in any way in the near-term future without more military affairs?
Well, distinguishing delusional statements and thinking from belief is difficult. I don't know how much he actually believes and how much he says because he wants it to be true, and he thinks that miraculously between the time he says it and some point in the future it could be made real. I just don't know. I think the world, if you look at Trump as a radio, I think the world, most of it has largely turned him off. No one pays that much attention to anything he says. A friend of mine just came back from upstate New York, where he's from, and he spent a lot of time up there. Utica and north all the way up to the Canadian border, traveling around, seeing friends. And he said no one up there is even remotely interested in anything in the Iranian conflict. He said most of them don't pay much attention to it, but they are paying attention to the rises in fuel prices, the changes in the price of food. I think at some point there's going to be a collision with reality for him. But it's not going to come in the way he thinks. It's not going to be a magical transformation of the Persian Gulf into a little lake that we call, his personal pond, and everyone is operating freely. I think it's going to come in the form of rising prices and real anger here at home as well as overseas.
Now, you mentioned real anger. Also related to this is some information coming out here in about the last 24 hours or so, where the Iranian side has said that they have been working with the Omani side on coming up with a new map, I guess, of how the flows will go out. They say that's distinct from whether there's going to be tolls or not, or getting it reopened, but it's like you're going to say, here's where the traffic will go. We have been putting a lot of pressure on Oman and to not have anything to do with the Iranian side, not to make any kind of an agreement, et cetera. And so much so that yesterday President Trump said, "I will bomb the S out of Oman if they don't get out of the way or so." What do you make of his public claim about actually bombing one of our friends in the region?
Well, it's an innovative form of foreign policy that I think is going to produce catastrophe. It already has. It's only going to get worse from here. It's not that people don't believe him. I think people are eminently concerned about his capacity for stupid actions and dangerous outcomes. So I'm sure in Oman, the Muscat of Oman is very concerned about the whole thing. Problem is there's not a lot he can do about it. What he can do is realize that at some point we're going to fall apart and leave, but he's still going to live next door to Persia or Iran. And I think that's what most people finally conclude. We can come and go. We sail in, we sail out. We fly in, we fly out. But this enormous power called Persia and Iran, which has always loomed large in that region, is now the de facto major regional power. And so if he has to sustain some bombing damage and get along ultimately long-term with his neighbor, I think he's going to get along long-term with his neighbor. In the meantime, that's just going to add more fuel to the fire against us. The Saudis, all the Emirates, the various statelets, and now increasingly Israel, I might add, all privately know we can't protect them. I think that's a very important recognition.
And even aside from the very painful fact that we can't protect any of the sultanates or our own bases for that matter, two questions. First of all, do you think that this is just rhetoric, that Trump would never actually do that? Or is there a possibility that he could potentially bomb Oman if they don't come to the, quote, right decision?
Oh, I would not dismiss out of hand anything that he says when it comes to the use of force. We've already seen plenty of evidence for that. He says, I'm going to hit this, that, or the next thing, and eventually we get around to it and we do that. So I think his threats have to be taken very seriously. And at this point, what else has he really got? I mean, that's what we have to keep in mind. What else does he have in his so-called toolbox? What incentives are there for anybody in the region to cooperate with us, to work with us towards some sort of viable end, when we've demonstrated that the only acceptable outcome, as he puts it, is abject surrender, right? You've got to surrender to me. Otherwise, nothing's there, which means that Iran is targeted or scheduled for total destruction. The Iranians know that, which is why the Iranians are paying no attention to anything he says. They are simply doing what they did for years, which is preparing for the worst. And they are still preparing for the worst, only now I think they're going to take the offensive. We can talk a little bit about that if you want.
Yes, I do. But before we get into that, though, in the event that does happen, and we do strike Oman, who's obviously been a friend of the United States for decades, if not centuries, a lot of it goes back even into the 1800s, late 1800s. What would that do to our relationship with the other Gulf Arab nations? I mean, with Kuwait, with UAE, with Qatar, with Saudi Arabia. If they see that we're willing to bomb them when they don't do what they're told, what would that do to their relationship? Would that cause them to fall more in line, or would that cause them to actually also want to rupture our relationship?
Well, if we look at Saudi Arabia, I think they've already figured it out. And the Saudis know that there's no long-term future based on any kind of friendship. And, this business of talking about friends and enemies, but people fail to understand, and a large part of this is because of Trump. Trump talks about everything as though it's a personal matter for him. Oh, I am friends with Mohammed bin Salman. I am good friends with so-and-so. And I have a great relationship with so. All that's crap. It's all irrelevant, has never meant anything, never will mean anything. What counts are interests. And right now, the Saudi interest is probably to cut a new arrangement with other powers that can offer it what we cannot. Now, who are they? Well, you're looking at the Turks and the Pakistanis, two Sunni Muslim powers. Neither of those powers have much in the way of oil, and both of them are a little cash poor. What does Saudi Arabia have? It's got cash and a lot of oil. So I think the Saudis are already demonstrating conclusively that as far as they're concerned, we are not a reliable partner. I also think that they're taking a lot of heat for having essentially played the poodle for Israel. And that's over. The UAE is taking its own position on all of these things, and they're shipping cash and gold to Iran to persuade the Iranians to leave them alone and not destroy what they own. Kuwait is desperate, obviously, but Kuwait is already on the agenda for dissolution. Remember, the Iranians go back to our war in which we, quote unquote, liberated Kuwait from Iraqi occupation. And their view is that, well, Iraq, which is now an ally of Iran, should control Kuwait in any case. And I think we're going to see that happen. I mean, these are all things that are in this giant cauldron that is bubbling with a great deal of unhappy people in it. We're just at the beginning of this process. So I think you're right. I think President Trump is becoming more desperate with each passing day, and he cannot bring himself to publicly admit that his attempt to gain control of the Persian Gulf has failed. It's not going to happen anytime soon. And for all the talk about what's getting through, the equivalent of maybe one ship a day slips through, if that.
Right. And I want to go back to talk about Trump thinks that the whole thing is just open and operating. As you say, there's just a trickle that's getting through. And a lot of that is coming actually from the Iranian side. We claim that nothing is, but apparently some is going to China, for example. That the other issue that he raises here is that there are no talks going on, that nothing is happening, even though he said we were semi-negotiating before. But if you listen to Jared Kushner, he seems to think there are talks going on.
So right now, President Trump's been very focused on the economic pressure. He really feels strongly about the blockade. If you look at the Iranian economy, it's way worse off. It was bad before the war. It's way worse off now. But President Trump's been very clear on why he took the actions he took, which is he believes that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. And if Iran is willing to, finish the deal that they've been discussing with us to give up their ability to create a nuclear weapon, then obviously he's willing to make a deal that could be great for the Iranian people, and he's it's something he would be open to. But right now, they're not showing any interest in doing something that makes sense for us.
Yeah, something that makes sense for us. Yeah, no kidding. We had a deal, Doug, which is called the Memorandum of Understanding, that was supposed to lead to an end of war negotiations on all kinds of fronts, and we blew that up within days of signing it. So whether we're talking to them, whether we're not, whether there's intermediaries, there is nothing, there's no reason, there's no logic that they would ever agree to anything now. So if that's the case, then why are we even bothering to have this fiction that we're talking to anybody? And if we're not going to go back to a war to solve this, which we can't because we don't have the assets or the defensive, they have the defensive capability to resist it, where is this going as far as Trump is concerned?
Well, I think it's very important to listen to Jared Kushner. Jared Kushner is kind of a double agent. On the one hand, he is Mr. Netanyahu's personal liaison with President Trump and effectively the United States government. So whatever he says should be taken seriously because you're listening to the preferences, in fact, I would argue the demands of Mr. Netanyahu. It's just as you've got to listen to someone like Ben Gvir, who is the equivalent of the director of the FBI inside Israel, and take very seriously what he says. And he's been making comments along the lines of we should kill 40 or 50 of the residents of Gaza every night or something because they're not people. They're not human. We just need to continue this day after day after day. Again, you've got to take him seriously because he's speaking for Mr. Netanyahu in a domestic sense. And that also has international implications. But there's something else. Kushner has incredibly unprecedented access to the President of the United States. And I think it's more than just access. I think he, frankly, wields enormous influence over the president and, as a result, over the United States, determines what is important and what is not. So I have some bad news for everyone. If you follow his line of reasoning to the inevitable endpoint that we're talking about, you have a resumption of conflict with Iran. In the meantime, you get this naval blockade, and one wonders what the naval blockade is doing other than making the world miserable because, as you just pointed out, a ship gets out about every day. It's usually filled to the brim with oil and it goes to China. If it doesn't go to China, it goes to India. Ultimately, the Koreans and the Japanese need it desperately, so they're trying to get it as well. But that has nothing to do with us. What we're trying to do is fulfill Mr. Trump's personal obligations to Greater Israel. And that's where we are. And so I don't see how you get Greater Israel, which I think is another illusion anyway, but I don't see how you get it unless you get the United States Armed Forces back into the fight against Iran. Not that that will guarantee success, but that's the best that the Israeli state and its agents here in the United States like Kushner could hope for.
Well, I'll tell you somebody who is listening to Kushner, and that is the Iranian side. They're also listening to Trump when he talks about taking over the Strait of Hormuz, when he talks about in the past about annihilating their civilization. They've been paying a lot of attention to that. And I think it was actually earlier today, Ghalibaf went on Iranian television and said, about the release in the Strait of Hormuz.
And let me make it clear. Until America implements its commitments under the Memorandum of Understanding, including lifting the blockade, on the release of frozen assets, lifting the oil sanctions, adding threats and military operations on all fronts, and other conditions that America has agreed to, the strait will not be reopened.
So now he's saying, look, what the deal that we had on June 17th about a couple things that had to be up front, but then the strait gets open first. They said, now that's off the table. Now then, if you want a diplomatic settlement, you have to give us the release of the funds. You have to give us the sanctions relief. You have to end the war in Lebanon, and that means Israel withdrawing from their perspective. And then you have to completely open your blockade and move all your troops out, which, of course, Trump is never going to do any of those things. So, I mean, it's an obvious question, I suppose, but where does that leave us?
Well, I think it's important to understand that having killed the initial generation of leaders early in the campaign, we now have people that are in charge who are infinitely more determined. Not that the last group wasn't, but now their view is there is no point in talking to Trump or anybody else from Washington. In fact, in Tehran, they've concluded you might as well just open direct talks with Netanyahu because he's ultimately in control. And clearly that's not going to happen. So it gets back to your original question. What kind of course are we on? We're on a collision course. It's a collision course with reality, which reality dictates more war. Now, at some point, it all collapses because we can't keep it up. Now, we've already seen problems in the Navy. Now, how severe they are, how many problems they've had aboard ship, that's a matter for speculation. We can't know without being there. And there are various reports that conflict with each other. But we can imagine that if you keep people at sea for almost, 10 months, 290 days, that they're going to be miserable. Gee, what a shocker. But there's something else going on. And this goes to your comment about what can we do. We have serious problems with logistics. You'll remember when this whole thing started, one of our discussion points was Iran is fighting on its doorstep, much like Russia is fighting on its doorstep. Well, that's an enormous advantage that we don't have. We have to ship everything 6,000 miles. And we have very few ports in the area that are really open to us for any length of time because we're not terribly popular. We're seen as the problem, as the source of the war. Now, if you don't have very many ports that you can go to, then you turn to naval resupply. Well, naval resupply has changed over many decades. We've cut back on the numbers of ships. In fact, I don't know that we have any right now that are manned by Navy sailors that reprovision ships. What we used to do is you had a fleet of commercial vessels that would come out to a certain point. Then U.S. Navy resupply ships that were actually armed would take over and they would complete the delivery process. We don't do that anymore. And it's a much more problematic and dangerous situation. And then finally, we don't have the depth and the force. You know, when we operated back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, even in the early 90s, we still had well over 300, 400 ships. Not anymore. We have, I think the latest count was 189 ships in the active or regular Navy. I don't know what we have beyond that in terms of support, but it's a shadow of what it once was. So we're in a very difficult position. Otherwise, there would not be this tremendous emphasis right now behind the scenes on preparing every B-52, every B-1, every B-2 for operations against Iran, because they can fly these vast distances. And that's why we have sent more and more refueling assets into the region. We're running this, I don't want to say on a shoestring, but certainly, you know, it's on a very fragile basis logistically.
And even on top of the logistics, I mean, the question comes in, what can you do? And I'm going to get into some of the statements that have been coming out just in some Western media and other statements that have been coming out of Tehran, which indicate that we're about to find out what we can do militarily. But let's look at what President Trump said, I think it was yesterday or day before, that answering the question about the ammunition stockpiles, about the JASSMs, about the Tomahawks, the PRSMs and other things for ATACMs, for example. He says, you know what? Yeah, we don't have as many of those as we want, but what we've used so far is peanuts. We've got all the ammunition we will ever need to go back and do whatever we need to do. Isn't that true?
Well, we can carpet bomb. That means that every B-52, for instance, that you send over the target area carries 90 500-pound bombs. And you can fly these in formation, and you're not going to hit with great precision, but whatever happens to be under those falling bombs is ultimately going to be destroyed. Now, have we done this? Yes, of course we've done it. We did it in Vietnam. And did it work? Sometimes they call these arc light strikes, these massive B-52 strikes would come in. We got started down that road during the Second World War, and in Normandy, for days, we flew over a very small area, hundreds of aircraft with thousands and tons of these bombs that opened up the German defensive line long enough for us to get through it in great numbers. What are we going to do with that in Iran? I mean, about the only thing that you can do with any certainty is hit cities. So now you're back to doing what we did to the Germans and to the Japanese. I don't know very many people who are completely convinced that that won the war. Certainly didn't win the war against Germany, but it certainly paved the road for the advance of the Soviet armies into Central Europe. That it did. When you go to Japan, we certainly killed large numbers of people, but we think in retrospect the submarine offensive, which isolated the Japanese home islands, was reducing everybody to feeding on rats. So I'm not a big advocate for going in and carpet bombing Iranian cities thinking that that's going to help. I don't think it will. So then you go to the next step. Well, if that's not the answer, why don't we do the Elbridge-Colby thing? Elbridge-Colby's been running around Washington for some time now. In addition to preaching war against China, he also likes to talk about tactical nuclear weapons. And we've talked about this before. My view is I agree with Colin Powell when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs. It said, oh, yes, if we use a couple of tactical nuclear weapons, this is back in the 90s. Oh, I'm sure the Soviets will look at this. Oh, well, that's just a small nuke. We don't need to become too excited over that. And of course, his point was obvious. What are you, stupid? If you use a tactical nuclear weapon, the incentive exists for the opposing side to use everything they can. Now, I don't know what the Iranians have. I have no idea. But this also then raises the question, depending upon how much damage you do, does this then precipitate something everybody's been talking about, which is the August 1914 scenario, where suddenly China and Russia both enter into the fray? That could happen. I hope not. I don't think they want to. I don't see any evidence that that's their preference. But I don't think they're going to stand by and allow us to completely obliterate or incinerate Iran. So I wish I had a better answer for you, but